Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe and tap the bell icon. The room was quiet. So quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the soft shuffle of papers on a nearby desk, and the tapping of heels on the polished hardwood floor. The courtroom, a place of justice and order, felt heavy with tension that had been building for days. There was something in the air today that felt different, unsettling in a way no one could quite put their finger on. A young boy sat nervously in the witness stand. His tiny figure, hardly able to see over the podium, hunched under the weight of the moment. His hands gripped the sides of the stand, knuckles white, as he tried to steady his breath. His face was pale, his eyes wide and filled with fear, yet there was something else, a quiet resolve that spoke of a life far more complicated than his tender age. The courtroom had been in session for hours. The case was routine. A family dispute over guardianship, a child caught in the middle of it all. The usual legal drama. But it wasn't the case that had people whispering, it was the boy himself. His presence had made people uneasy. His name, his appearance, his gaze, there was something about him that just didn't sit right. Some of the lawyers had exchanged knowing looks, as if they knew something the others didn't. It was an unsettling feeling, like standing at the edge of something dangerous, though no one dared speak it aloud. Judge Karen Miller had been presiding over court cases for years. She was a woman of composure, known for her calm demeanor, unwavering fairness, and strict adherence to the law. Her reputation was impeccable, and in all the years she had spent in this courtroom, no one had ever thrown her off balance. Yet, as she sat at the bench today, her eyes lingered on the boy in the witness stand. There was an odd sense of familiarity in his eyes, something she couldn't quite explain, but she shook it off as she focused on the case at hand. "Next case," she called, flipping through the stack of paperwork in front of her. It was a monotonous job. The same faces, the same arguments, the same legal jargon. But today was different. The child's case had started off like any other. His name was Daniel, and his parents were embroiled in a bitter legal battle. But there was something about Daniel that didn't seem to fit with the situation at hand. The boy wasn't crying, though he should have been. His parents were at each other's throats, and it was clear from the moment they walked in that neither of them was particularly interested in his well-being. But Daniel didn't seem fazed by it. In fact, he seemed calm, eerily calm. When his turn came, Daniel had been called to the stand with a quiet urgency. He looked at the judge, his brown eyes reflecting a deep sadness, but also something far more piercing. The judge had glanced at him, trying to break the tension, but even her usual words of comfort, "Everything is okay, Daniel. You're safe here," had done little to soothe the boy's nerves. Then, just when it seemed like the hearing was following its predictable course, something happened. The moment was sudden. And then it was over just as quickly. The words that Daniel spoke would echo in the minds of everyone who heard them for the rest of their lives. "You're my mom." The words hung in the air, sharp and clear, like the ringing of a bell in a silent cathedral. There was a beat of absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the room had frozen in place. The stenographer's fingers hovered over the keys, unsure of what had just happened. The lawyers stopped mid-sentence, their arguments forgotten, their faces pale with shock. The audience, somewhere between spectators and silent witnesses, shifted in their seats, the air growing thick with confusion and disbelief. Judge Miller, who had seen everything from murders to corporate fraud, was suddenly at a loss. She had faced chaos in the courtroom before, but this was something different. The words came from a child, but they carried a weight far heavier than anyone could have anticipated. "You're my mom," Daniel repeated, his voice slightly more confident this time. His eyes didn't leave hers. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Just calm certainty. And a strange, almost eerie, determination. Judge Miller's hand faltered over the gavel. She stared at the boy, her mind racing. She had no children. She had never been married. She had never even entertained the idea of motherhood, not in the traditional sense, at least. And yet, here was a child, barely 12 years old, telling her she was his mother. Her breath caught in her throat. She forced her hand to steady, though it took every ounce of concentration she had. The courtroom had erupted into whispers. The tension, once barely noticeable, now gripped everyone in the room. The eyes of the attorneys were locked on the judge, awaiting her reaction. "Excuse me?" Judge Miller said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she cleared her throat. She wasn't sure whether she was speaking to the boy or to herself. "What did you just say?" Daniel's gaze remained unbroken. "You're my mom," he said again, this time with a hint of something that sounded almost like a plea. There was no sign of fear in his voice now. Instead, there was only a deep, unsettling calmness. A calmness that didn't belong in a child who had just been thrust into the adult world of courtroom drama. The room shifted again, but it wasn't just the people present who were affected. Outside the courtroom, through the long corridor, through the courthouse doors, and even in the offices beyond, the echo of Daniel's words began to spread. It felt as if time itself had paused, just long enough for those in the room to try to make sense of the impossible. Judge Miller blinked, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Could this child have somehow mistaken her for someone else? Was it a mistake, a slip of the tongue? Surely, that was it. But there was something in Daniel's eyes, something deep and knowing, that stopped her from brushing it aside. Something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It was the unmistakable sensation that something had just shifted. That something unexpected, something that defied logic and reason, was about to unfold before them. I need you to explain yourself, young man," the judge said, her voice regaining some measure of authority. She couldn't afford to be rattled, not here, not in front of so many people. She tried to maintain her composure, but the unease gnawed at her insides. She wasn't just the judge in this courtroom. She was a person, a human being, and that small, simple statement had cut to the very core of her identity. Daniel tilted his head slightly, as though considering her words. The room fell into an eerie stillness once more, the anticipation hanging thick in the air. "I can't explain it, but I know," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I've known for a long time. You're my mom." It was as if his words were a key to a locked door that no one had ever known existed. It was impossible. But, somehow, it felt real. And that was what made it so terrifying. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder, spreading like wildfire. Whispers turned into hushed conversations, then into frantic questions exchanged across the room. People leaned in, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but no one could. It was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Judge Karen Miller's mind raced. Her heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the edges of her bench, forcing herself to focus. The boy, Daniel, sat there in front of her, still unwavering in his gaze. He seemed calm. Far too calm for someone who had just dropped a bombshell like that. She had expected an apology, an explanation that would make sense of the bizarre words, but there was nothing. His silence was as loud as the words he had spoken. "Daniel," the judge began again, her voice steady but filled with confusion. "What are you talking about? I am not your mother. I don't know who you are." The boy cut her off, his voice soft but firm. "I know you're my mom. I've always known." The words hit her like a slap to the face. The audacity of them. The calmness. The certainty. It didn't make sense. But the more she tried to deny it, the more the boy's words seemed to resonate with an uncomfortable truth that she couldn't quite explain. The attorneys in the room shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. This was no longer just a case about family disputes, it had become something far more complex, far more personal. One of the lawyers, a young man named Peter, stood up cautiously and addressed the judge, his voice trembling slightly. "Your Honor, I don't think we should continue with the proceedings until we figure out what's going on here," Peter said. This is an extraordinary claim. Perhaps we should have a break to process this." Judge Miller raised her hand, silencing the room. She wasn't sure if it was her authority or something else, but the room fell back into a strange silence. She wasn't ready for this. No one was. "Daniel, you need to explain yourself. This doesn't make sense." "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" she asked, her voice more pleading than commanding now. The boy nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't need to explain it, because I know it's true." His words were simple. Childish, almost. But there was an undertone of something deeper. A quiet certainty that rattled the judge to her core. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, waiting for her next move. This was no longer about the case. It was about something personal, something that threatened to dismantle everything she had built in her life. Judge Miller stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with an unsettling screech. She looked down at the boy. There was a strange connection between them, a pull she couldn't explain. His eyes held something familiar, something haunting. "Where is your mother, Daniel?" she asked, her voice quiet but intense. Daniel's face shifted for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossing his features, something like sadness. He swallowed, his small throat moving as he tried to find the words. "She's not here," he said simply. She's not the one you think." A silence descended over the courtroom once again. The words hung in the air, each syllable a weight that pressed down on everyone's chest. The judge didn't know whether she was hearing the ramblings of a child or something far more sinister. For the first time in her career, Judge Miller felt a wave of uncertainty. She had faced cases involving murder, fraud, and deception, but none of them had felt as personal as this. The boy wasn't lying. She could tell. But his story was one she couldn't make sense of. "Daniel, tell me everything." "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper now, almost desperate for some kind of explanation that would make all of this make sense. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching the room as if looking for someone, something. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter, almost to himself. "I didn't know at first. But I remember. I remember when I was little. I remember seeing you. And I remember feeling like I knew you." He paused, his voice trembling now, as if the weight of his own words was beginning to affect him. "And then I saw you again. And I knew." Judge Miller's heart skipped a beat. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. What was he saying? What did he mean? This was impossible. "I don't remember much, but I know," Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. "You've been in my life. You've been there, even when I couldn't see you. You were always there." Judge Miller felt a chill run down her spine. She took a step back, her mind racing. This wasn't just about the boy anymore. This was something else. Something that reached back into the depths of her own past, a past she had buried for years, a past she had tried to forget. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice cracking under the strain. "Who are you? Why are you saying this?" Daniel's eyes softened, a hint of sadness crossing his face. He was still a child. Still young. But there was something in his gaze, a depth that she hadn't seen before. It was as if he had lived a lifetime in his few years. "I don't know how, but you're my mom. I can feel it. You'll remember, eventually. You'll remember me." The words hit her like a wave, drowning her in a flood of emotions she couldn't begin to process. She staggered back slightly, gripping the edge of the bench for support. Her mind spun in circles. She felt dizzy, unsteady. She had to be imagining this. She had to be. But there was a small part of her, the part she had spent so many years burying, that whispered a different truth. A truth she wasn't ready to face. "Your Honor," said Peter, his voice tentative as he stepped forward, "I think we need to adjourn. This situation is beyond what we can handle here. We need to investigate." But Judge Miller wasn't listening anymore. She was staring at Daniel, her mind lost in a sea of memories, a tangled web of forgotten faces and moments long buried. The child in front of her was telling her something she wasn't ready to hear. A soft murmur rippled through the room, and the words from earlier echoed in her mind, "You're my mom." Judge Karen Miller stood motionless, her eyes locked on Daniel. The silence in the room was suffocating, the weight of the boy's words pressing down on her with an intensity she couldn't shake. The courtroom, which moments ago had been filled with routine discussions of legal jargon, now felt like a foreign place. Every corner seemed darker, every sound amplified, every person a mere blur of faces as her mind raced. Daniel's words hung in the air, like a fog that refused to clear. "You're my mom." There was a deep, unsettling truth in his voice, a truth that no one in the room could ignore. Judge Miller's heart hammered in her chest, and her thoughts scrambled for a way to make sense of it all. She had been a judge for over 20 years, managing cases of unimaginable complexity, but this was different. This was personal. This was a puzzle that went deeper than the surface. The murmurs around her grew louder, an almost imperceptible buzz of confusion and disbelief. The stenographer hesitated, her fingers frozen over the keyboard, unsure whether to continue typing or to wait for the storm to pass. Peter, the young attorney, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Judge Miller before looking back at Daniel. But she didn't see any of them. She only saw the boy. His face was so calm, his demeanor so assured, it was as if he wasn't the least bit shaken by the chaos around him. It was as if he had known all along that this moment was coming. How could he know? Judge Miller's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. She had spent decades building a career defined by rules, order, and precision. She had spent years managing the lives of others, making decisions for them, helping them pick up the pieces of their shattered worlds. But now, here she was, a woman caught in the grip of a truth she couldn't deny. And there was no precedent for this. There was no rulebook, no manual, no case law to guide her. It was just her and the boy in front of her, and the deep, sinking feeling that there was more to his words than she was ready to face. "Daniel," she said, her voice a little shaky now, though she tried to steady herself. She wanted to ask him more, to understand what was happening, but her mind refused to cooperate. The only question that kept repeating itself in her head was the one that she feared to ask aloud. "Why now? Why are you telling me this now?" Daniel's eyes softened. There was no anger or malice in them, just a quiet sadness, an understanding that seemed far beyond his years. He took a deep breath before answering. "I couldn't keep it a secret anymore," he said softly. "I've waited as long as I could. I've tried to understand it myself. But I know you're the one. You'll remember." His words were so calm, so matter-of-fact. But Judge Miller was struggling to process them, to make sense of the impossible. She couldn't remember. She couldn't even begin to piece together how this could be true. Her mind was spinning with fragments of memories, snippets of faces, moments in time that had been locked away for years. But it wasn't enough. The pieces didn't fit. She felt her pulse quicken, the cold sweat on her palms threatening to make her lose her grip on reality. How had this child, this stranger, come to know her? How could he possibly know anything about her life? Her mind raced back to her early days as a young woman, newly graduated and full of ambition. She had been consumed by her career, determined to build a life that others could admire. But there had been a time, before everything she had achieved, that had been marked by mistakes. Mistakes she had tried to forget. A decision made in haste, one born of fear and uncertainty, a decision she had buried deep inside herself. The woman. The child. The memory of the tiny apartment, the echoes of a life she had left behind. But none of it made sense. Not yet. "Daniel," Judge Miller said, her voice cracking as she attempted to steady herself. "Where did you come from? Who's your mother? How do you know this?" Daniel didn't flinch at her questions. Instead, his face softened even more, as though he understood the storm of confusion in her heart. "I don't know where she is. I don't know where we went after that. But I know she gave me to you. I know you're my mom." The words hit her like a physical blow. She gave him to me? It was as if the world had tilted on its axis. Judge Miller could feel the room spinning, her vision blurring as memories long buried surged to the surface. Her hands shook as she reached for the edge of the bench, trying to steady herself. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, and she felt her chest tighten with each inhale. She could feel the walls of the courtroom closing in on her. This wasn't supposed to be happening. She wasn't supposed to be here, caught in this web of uncertainty. And yet, she was. And there was no escaping it. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How could I have forgotten? How could I have?" "You didn't forget," Daniel interjected softly, his voice a comfort amidst her panic. "You were just scared. You didn't want to remember. But you will. I know you will." Judge Miller blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in her mind. His words seemed to hold a certainty, an absolute belief, that unsettled her even more. He wasn't just some confused child making wild claims. There was something real in his words. Something that made her feel as though the ground beneath her was shifting. Her eyes darted around the room, seeking some kind of support, some indication that someone else understood what was happening. But everyone was just as lost as she was. No one could offer any answers. No one could explain what this boy's presence meant. No one could tell her what she was supposed to do next. And that scared her more than anything. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling, "you don't understand. You can't be my son. It's not possible." Daniel's gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering. His small body sat straighter now, his voice firmer. "It is possible. I know it's possible. I've always known you were my mom, even if you didn't know me. I've always known you'd remember." His words struck deep, like a knife twisting in her gut. They weren't just words, they were a challenge. A challenge to the very foundation of everything she had built. A challenge to the lies she had convinced herself were truths. A challenge to the life she had so carefully constructed, the life that had allowed her to bury her past, to bury the pain. Her mind raced as the memories began to flood her. It was like trying to sift through 1,000 pieces of shattered glass, each fragment reflecting something she couldn't quite make sense of. There was the woman, Sarah, who had given birth to Daniel, who had left him in her care. There was the apartment, the broken promises, the choices she had made. There were years lost, forgotten, hidden in the corners of her mind. But it was all so tangled, so incomplete. She didn't know where to start. She didn't know where to finish. "Why now?" she asked again, her voice desperate. "Why would you come here and say this to me? After all this time?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Because you need to know, Judge Miller. You need to know who you really are. You need to remember that this wasn't just a mistake. You are my mom, and I've always known it." The air in the courtroom felt thick, suffocating, as if the weight of those words had become too much to bear. Judge Miller's body trembled, and she placed a hand over her heart as though trying to stop it from pounding through her chest. "How could I have forgotten you?" she whispered to herself, as much as to him. Daniel's eyes softened. "You didn't forget. You just closed it away. But it's time to open it now. It's time to face the truth." The truth. That word hung in the air, echoing around her like a bell tolling in the distance. The truth was slipping through her fingers, just out of reach. And yet, Daniel was holding it, he was carrying it for her. Holding the key to a door she had locked and thrown away the key to so many years ago. And in that moment, Judge Miller realized that there was no turning back. There was no pretending anymore. The truth had found its way into the courtroom, and it was pulling her back into the past she had tried so hard to forget. The courtroom remained eerily silent. Every eye was fixed on Judge Miller, but no one could dare to speak. The weight of what had just been revealed hung in the air like a heavy fog. Everyone felt it, those in the courtroom, the witnesses, even the jurors. A shiver ran down Judge Miller's spine as the world around her seemed to shift. It was as if reality had warped, and she was no longer in control of the narrative. She could no longer deny it. The boy, Daniel, was somehow connected to her past in ways she could not understand, in ways she didn't know if she wanted to understand. She looked down at him. His face, so calm and yet so full of something she couldn't quite place: trust? Hope? Or was it something else? It was as if the child had been waiting for her to remember something, to open the door that had been sealed shut for so many years. But what was it she had forgotten? She turned her gaze away from him, focusing instead on the floor beneath her. Her mind felt like a battlefield. Every thought seemed to pull her in different directions, battling for her attention, demanding an answer to the riddle that had so suddenly emerged in her life. Who was Daniel? Why had he come here, now, with this revelation? "Your Honor," a voice broke through her thoughts, and she startled, looking up to find Peter, the young attorney, standing. His eyes were wide, his voice shaky. It was clear he was trying to maintain control, but the situation had spiraled far beyond what he could handle. Do you need a moment?" Karen nodded slowly, her hand still pressed to her chest as she tried to calm her breathing. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A moment." With a wave of her hand, she signaled for the courtroom to be adjourned temporarily. The murmur of voices began again as people stood, collected their things, and began to leave, but Karen didn't move. She felt rooted to her seat, her body tense, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. This was her life. This was her story, and yet, it had suddenly become more than she could bear to face. As the courtroom emptied, the silence that remained felt more oppressive than before. Daniel didn't move either. He sat still in the witness stand, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his gaze never wavering from Judge Miller. There was no panic in his expression, no sense of urgency, just a quiet, knowing patience. And for a long moment, Judge Miller simply stared at him, trying to find some shred of clarity in the chaos of her thoughts. Finally, she stood, and with shaky steps, she walked toward him, her mind still foggy, but her body acting on some primal instinct that told her this was a confrontation she had to face. "Daniel," she began, her voice weak, fragile, as though testing the weight of the name. "You're telling me that you're my son. That somehow, I knew your mother, and she gave you to me?" Daniel didn't flinch, didn't react in any dramatic way. He simply nodded. "Yes. That's exactly what I'm saying." "But how?" She took a step closer, her voice growing more frantic as the flood of memories pushed to the surface. "How do you know this? How do you know me?" Daniel met her gaze, unwavering, and for a moment, something in his eyes softened. "I don't know all the details. I just know what I remember. You're not a stranger to me, Judge Miller. I know I've been waiting for you to remember. You might not remember me, but I've always remembered you." Judge Miller's heart sank as his words hit her like a hammer, shattering the fragile walls she'd built around her past. How could he remember? "Why didn't you say something before?" Karen's voice cracked, barely holding back the tears threatening to spill. "Why now? Why didn't you come to me sooner?" Daniel lowered his eyes for the briefest of moments, then looked back up at her. "Because I didn't have a choice. It wasn't my decision. But I've been looking for you, trying to find a way to make you remember. I didn't want to come here, I didn't want to put this all in front of you. But it's the only way now. You need to know the truth. You need to know everything." Judge Miller stepped back, the weight of his words sinking in. Her heart pounded as she grappled with the incomprehensible reality of the situation. All these years, she had kept her past buried, locked away, never allowing it to surface. She had chosen to forget, forced herself to forget. The memories were too painful, too overwhelming to confront. She had made a life for herself, a career, a reputation. But now, Daniel was telling her that none of it mattered. None of it could protect her from the truth. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice a whisper of desperation. She needed to know, she needed to understand. Daniel nodded again, slowly. "I don't know all the details, but I can tell you this. Your name wasn't always Karen Miller. It was Sarah, too. That's my mother's name. My real mother. But that was before everything changed. Before they told you to leave." "Leave?" Karen echoed, confused. "Leave where?" Daniel swallowed hard, his face hardening with emotion. "They told you to leave the apartment. You had to leave us. You had to let her go. But she gave me to you, Karen. She gave me to you because she couldn't keep me. She made sure I would be safe." The weight of his words crushed her chest. The room seemed to spin around her, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse. But she steadied herself, leaning against the stand for support. I didn't leave her," Judge Miller murmured, shaking her head. "I couldn't have. I wouldn't have." Daniel's voice softened, almost tender. "You did. But it wasn't your choice. You couldn't remember, but I've always known. I've always known you were my mother, and I've been waiting for you to see the truth." The truth. That word again. Karen's head swam, but there was one thing she was certain of: the memories were beginning to unravel, thread by thread, piece by piece. And with each passing second, the man she had become, the judge, the authority, seemed further and further away. The woman she had been before, the woman who had made the choices, the decisions, was starting to come into view. She was seeing her past in flashes, bits of a life she had buried, a life she had chosen to forget. The woman who had been Sarah. The woman who had been forced to make the impossible decision. The woman who had given her a child. A child who now sat in front of her, asking her to remember. "Tell me about my mother," Daniel said softly, his voice laced with a quiet urgency. "Tell me who I really am. Tell me what happened." And for the first time in a long while, Karen Miller felt herself begin to crack. The weight of the past was pushing against her, pressing in from all sides, urging her to remember. To accept the story that had been written for her so many years ago. With a shaky breath, she finally whispered, "I don't know if I can." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes full of understanding. "You can. You will. You just have to trust yourself." And that, more than anything, was what terrified her the most. To trust herself again. To trust the memories she had hidden. To trust that the pieces of the puzzle she had locked away could ever make sense again. The clock on the wall ticked, and with each second that passed, Judge Karen Miller felt more and more trapped in a world she had worked so hard to escape. Her body was frozen, as though it were caught in the eye of a storm, still and quiet, but the turbulence was threatening to tear everything apart. Daniel's words echoed in her mind, over and over, louder than any noise in the room. "You're my mom." The weight of them was suffocating, but it was nothing compared to the storm of memories threatening to surge to the surface. Her heart pounded against her chest. She could hear her breath growing more rapid, but she couldn't seem to control it. The past, once neatly tucked away behind the door she had locked, was now crashing in, unraveling everything she had tried to build. Daniel's presence was a constant reminder of a life she had abandoned, or rather, a life that had been taken from her. She hadn't wanted to remember, and yet here it was, all at once, the distant memories of a woman named Sarah, a name she hadn't spoken in years. It felt like a different person, someone she used to know, but now, she was merely a ghost haunting the corners of Karen's mind. She could feel the tension in the air around her, but it wasn't just the courtroom that felt suffocating. It was her life. Her past. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel didn't seem to need her to say anything, but Karen's silence was almost unbearable. What was she supposed to say? How could she even begin to explain the mess that her life had become? Finally, Daniel spoke again. His voice was low and steady, yet there was a quiet intensity behind it. "It's okay, Judge Miller," he said, using the title she had held for so long, but it sounded almost like a question. "I know it's hard. But I need you to remember. I need you to see the truth." Karen closed her eyes briefly, squeezing them shut as if trying to block out the chaos in her mind. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't. She was trapped in this room, trapped in this moment, and more than that, she was trapped in a past that had never truly left her. "How can I remember?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "How can I trust what you're saying? This doesn't make sense." Daniel's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly, as if trying to bridge the chasm between them. "I don't have all the answers," he said. "But I know what I feel. I know what I remember. You're my mom. And I don't want to lose you again." The words "lose you again" echoed through Karen's mind. She had spent years pushing everything about her past to the darkest corners of her mind, burying the emotions, the guilt, and the shame. She had built a life, one that was safe, secure, and free from the memories that haunted her. And yet, here was Daniel, holding the key to a past that had never really been gone, just waiting to resurface. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Karen asked, her voice catching in her throat. "I couldn't," Daniel said simply. "I couldn't force you to remember before you were ready." The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Karen felt like she was suffocating. She needed to understand. She needed answers. But how could she trust Daniel when she didn't even trust herself anymore? "I don't even remember the woman you're talking about," Karen admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't remember Sarah. I don't remember anything. How can I just remember? How can I believe that you're my son?" Daniel's eyes softened, a quiet understanding filling them. "It's okay to be scared," he said. "You don't have to remember everything at once. But you will. You'll remember. It'll come. It'll come." The words reverberated in her mind, the quiet comfort of them both soothing and terrifying. How could she trust that? How could she trust herself again? The years she had spent building this life, a life of control, of structure, of hiding her past, had created walls around her heart. But those walls were crumbling now, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face what lay beyond them. Karen shook her head slowly, the confusion and fear clawing at her insides. "I don't even know where to start. How do I begin to understand all of this?" Daniel didn't hesitate. He simply looked at her, his expression serious but patient. "You start with the truth. It won't be easy, but you have to face it. You can't hide anymore." Her heart hammered in her chest, the realization sinking in that he was right. She had spent so long running from the truth. From the past. From herself. But now, it was impossible to ignore. She couldn't outrun it. Not anymore. Karen took a shaky breath and finally looked at him, really looked at him. His face, so familiar yet so strange. His eyes, so like hers, and yet, so different. She saw a reflection of herself in his gaze, but it was a reflection she had buried deep down. It was the person she had tried to forget, the person she was trying to hide from. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You already are," Daniel said quietly. "You just need to keep going. I know you will." The words were simple, but they felt like a lifeline. For the first time, Karen realized something she had never been able to admit before: she wasn't as in control as she had always believed. No matter how hard she had tried to shape her life, no matter how hard she had tried to bury the truth, she had never really been in control. The truth was bigger than her, bigger than anything she had built. And now, it was coming for her. With trembling hands, Karen reached for the edge of the desk, needing something to hold on to. Her mind was a whirlwind of images, fragmented memories, flashes of the woman named Sarah, flashes of the child who had somehow ended up in her care. The past was like a puzzle, pieces scattered everywhere, and she was just beginning to see how they might fit together. "I need time," Karen said, her voice shaky. "I need to think. I need to understand." Daniel nodded. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." "I always will be." Karen looked at him, her heart heavy, her thoughts scattered, but there was something in his words, something in his presence, that made her believe him. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but somewhere deep inside her, she knew that the truth was coming. Whether she was ready or not, it was coming. The room was still. The weight of the moment lingered in the air. And for the first time, Karen felt the cracks in her carefully constructed world begin to widen. The truth was on its way, and there was no escaping it now. Karen Miller's hands trembled as she sat alone in her office, the room around her as silent as the storm raging in her mind. The faint hum of the air conditioning was the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet, but even that seemed too loud in the chaos of her thoughts. She had asked for time, but it felt like time was slipping through her fingers, like sand in the wind. Every passing second felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the truth was dragging her deeper into a reality she wasn't ready to face. The memory of Daniel's words, "You're my mom," echoed relentlessly in her mind, refusing to be silenced. It was an accusation, a plea, a truth wrapped in layers of mystery and pain. He had come to her, expecting her to remember, expecting her to know. And yet, she had no recollection, no understanding of the child he claimed her to be. It was as if the world she had built for herself, a world of logic, order, and control, was being slowly dismantled, piece by piece. Karen closed her eyes, trying to focus, but all she saw were fractured images, flashes of a woman with dark hair, a child's laughter, a life she had buried so deeply. She felt like a stranger in her own mind, like a woman lost in the fog of someone else's memories. How could I forget all of this? She rubbed her temples, trying to steady her breathing. The past was a murky river, one she had tried to cross and then left behind, but now, it was flooding back, and she was drowning in the current. The door to her office creaked open, and she looked up to see her assistant, Emily, standing in the doorway. Emily's face was etched with concern, but she didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, watching Karen with the kind of quiet understanding that made Karen's heart ache. Emily had always been her rock, the one person she could trust, the one person who knew her well enough to see through her facade. But today, Karen wasn't sure she could trust herself, let alone anyone else. "Judge Miller?" Emily's voice was gentle, as though testing the waters. You okay?" Karen didn't answer immediately. She just stared at the empty chair across from her, as though trying to see the answers there. The questions were too many, too overwhelming. How had she ended up here? How had she gone from the woman who had everything figured out to this broken shell of a person, questioning her own reality? "I'm fine," Karen said, her voice sounding hollow, even to herself. "Just thinking." Emily didn't seem convinced. She stepped closer, taking a seat across from Karen. "Thinking about what happened in court? Or something else?" Karen looked up at her assistant, her gaze distant, unfocused. "Something else," she murmured. "Something from a long time ago." Emily's expression softened. "Do you want to talk about it?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She had spent years perfecting the art of keeping her secrets, hiding the parts of herself that didn't fit the persona she had crafted. But here, now, with the weight of everything bearing down on her, Karen couldn't help but feel the desperate need to share. To release some of the pressure that had been building inside her for so long. "It's about the boy," Karen finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one in court?" Emily asked, her brows furrowing in confusion. "The one who said you were his mom?" Karen nodded slowly, the words still heavy on her tongue. "He's claiming I'm his mother. But I don't remember him. I don't remember anything." Emily leaned forward, her tone softening. "Karen, are you sure about that? I mean, is there a possibility that, maybe you do remember, but it's just blocked out? I've heard of that kind of thing happening, people forgetting parts of their past because of trauma or something." The thought hit Karen like a cold wave. Could that be true? Could she have suppressed the memories so deeply that they were now inaccessible to her? Had she been running from something so painful that her mind had locked it away, hoping to protect her from the truth? "I don't know," Karen admitted, her voice thick with uncertainty. "I don't know what to think anymore. But it's like there's a part of me, deep down, that knows he's telling the truth. But there's another part of me that can't believe it. Can't accept it." Emily nodded, her eyes full of concern. "That sounds really hard. But maybe you should talk to him. Maybe he's the key to unlocking all of this. If he knows something about your past, about Sarah, maybe he can help you remember." The mention of Sarah hit Karen like a jolt of electricity. She had tried so hard to forget that name. Tried so hard to bury it in the past. But now, with Daniel's words still ringing in her ears, it felt as though Sarah was the key, the link that could unravel everything. "I don't know if I can face him," Karen said softly, her voice tinged with fear. "What if I remember things that I don't want to remember? What if the truth is too much for me to bear?" Emily reached out, placing a hand on Karen's. It was a small gesture, but it grounded her in a way nothing else had. "I can't tell you what to do, Karen. But I do know this, you've always been strong. You've always faced the hard truths, no matter how difficult. And I think, deep down, you're ready to face this one too." Karen closed her eyes, the weight of Emily's words sinking in. She had been strong. She had fought her entire life to build the person she had become. But now, all of that was crumbling in the face of a truth she hadn't been prepared for. The life she had so carefully constructed was being torn apart, and all she had left were the broken pieces. "Maybe you're right," Karen whispered, more to herself than to Emily. "Maybe it's time I stopped running from the truth." For the first time in what felt like forever, Karen allowed herself to believe that she could find the courage to face the past. But it wasn't going to be easy. And it certainly wasn't going to be painless. There were too many unanswered questions, too many lost years, and too much fear of what she might uncover. But as Karen sat there, staring at the woman in front of her, she realized that she couldn't go on pretending anymore. She couldn't continue to hide from the past, hoping it would just go away. It was time to face it. The question was she ready? Karen stared at herself in the mirror, the reflection staring back at her as though it were a stranger. The woman in the glass seemed familiar yet distant, as though the years had warped her image into something unrecognizable. Her once confident eyes now seemed filled with doubt, uncertainty, and the weight of a past she had long since buried. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to steady herself. Her pulse raced, and her mind refused to stop spinning. The events of the past few days had left her reeling, unable to catch her breath. Daniel's words, "You're my mom," were still there, lingering, like an echo that refused to fade. And no matter how much she tried to push them away, they kept coming back, forcing her to face the reality she had avoided for so long. It had been 2 days since Daniel had spoken those words in the courtroom. 2 days, and yet it felt like a lifetime. She hadn't been able to sleep properly, her mind a constant whirl of questions, memories, and guilt. And each time she tried to dismiss the thoughts, they only grew louder. "You're my mom." The truth, her truth, was clawing at the walls of her mind, demanding to be heard. What if it's real? What if I've been living a lie all this time? Karen's grip tightened on the edge of the sink. She couldn't deny it any longer. There was something about Daniel's words that felt right, that felt true, despite the overwhelming disbelief. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her carefully constructed world had been built on a foundation of falsehoods. A knock on the door startled her, and she quickly turned away from the mirror, wiping her face as though trying to erase the vulnerability that had just crept in. She wasn't ready for anyone to see her like this, not yet. Not when the storm inside her was still raging. "Judge Miller?" Emily's voice came through the door, soft but insistent. "Can I come in?" Karen took a deep breath and walked over to the door, opening it just enough to peek through. Her assistant's face was full of concern, but there was something else in her eyes, something that made Karen hesitate. Emily had always been there for her, offering support when needed, but today, her gaze held a certain seriousness, as if she knew Karen was at a breaking point. "I need to talk to you," Emily said quietly, stepping inside when Karen nodded. Karen closed the door behind them and leaned against it, her arms crossed defensively. "What's going on, Emily?" "I've been doing some digging," Emily began, her tone cautious. "I know you said you needed time, but I think you need to hear this. I think it might help you understand what's really going on." Karen frowned. "What are you talking about?" Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I found something. Something about your past." The air in the room seemed to thicken, and Karen's stomach dropped. "What kind of something?" Emily's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Karen saw a flicker of fear. "I think I found your birth records." Karen froze. The words seemed to shatter the fragile hold she had on her own reality. Birth records? She hadn't even thought about her own past in years, let alone the documentation that might exist to prove who she was, or wasn't. I don't understand. What do my birth records have to do with any of this?" Emily took a deep breath and opened her phone, showing Karen a series of documents. "I found your birth certificate. And it's not what you've been told." Karen's eyes scanned the papers, her pulse quickening as she read through the details. The name listed was familiar, but it didn't match anything she had ever heard before. It was a name she had never spoken aloud, a name that belonged to someone she couldn't quite place. "My mother's name, it's not Sarah," Karen murmured, her voice shaking. "It's Ruth Miller," Emily finished for her, her voice quiet but firm. Karen's head spun. Ruth Miller. It was her name, her birth name. The name she had been born with before everything had changed. Before the name Karen Miller had become her shield. But there was something deeply unsettling about the documents. The date of birth was off by a few months, and there were additional records that didn't seem to match her recollections. What does this mean?" Karen whispered, feeling as though the ground beneath her was slipping away. Emily put her hand on Karen's shoulder, a gesture of comfort but also one of support. "I think it's time to talk to Daniel. He might be the missing piece." If your mother's name is Ruth, and if you've been kept in the dark about your own history, maybe there's more to this story than you're seeing. Karen shook her head, struggling to process everything that had been thrown at her in the last few minutes. She had thought she was in control. She had thought her life, her identity, was solid, a thing she could count on. But now, with the discovery of these records, the world she had built felt like a house of cards, trembling on the verge of collapse. "I don't know what to do," Karen whispered, feeling lost. "I don't know who I am anymore." "You are Karen Miller," Emily said softly. "But maybe it's time to look at that name with new eyes. Maybe it's time to confront what you've been running from." Karen's breath hitched as she looked down at the documents in her hand. The weight of the truth was suffocating, and she realized, with growing dread, that there was no escaping it. She couldn't outrun the past forever. She couldn't ignore the signs any longer. "Maybe you're right," Karen whispered, more to herself than to Emily. "Maybe it's time to face the truth. But I'm not sure I'm ready for what I might find." Emily nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. "You don't have to be ready. But I think you'll find that confronting the past might be the only way to move forward." The words lingered in the room, heavy and unsettling. Karen knew Emily was right, but the fear of what was waiting for her in the past was almost too much to bear. "I'll talk to Daniel," Karen said finally, her voice quiet but determined. "But I need to do this on my own." Emily gave her a small, supportive smile. "Take your time. I'll be here when you need me." Karen nodded, but inside, she knew the storm was far from over. The pieces of her life were scattered, and it was up to her to start putting them together. But the question remained, could she handle the truth that awaited her? As she looked at the records in her hand, Karen felt something inside her stir, something deep, something primal. It was the beginning of an unraveling. But how far would it go? Karen had never been one for uncertainty. It was a luxury she didn't afford herself. In her years as a judge, she had learned how to make quick decisions, how to remain composed under pressure, how to carve a path through the fog of doubt. But now, standing on the precipice of a past she had long buried, she realized how little control she truly had over her own life. The walls she had built, the foundation she had relied on, were crumbling before her eyes. And all that was left were pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she could put together. The records Emily had shown her, the birth certificate, the strange discrepancies, were still burning in Karen's mind. Ruth Miller. The name felt foreign, but at the same time, it tugged at something deep inside her, like a half-remembered dream she couldn't quite reach. And Daniel, the boy who had looked her in the eye and said, "You're my mom," was still out there, waiting for her to answer the questions he had planted so forcefully in her mind. The courtroom had been a battleground, a place where truths were often hidden behind the walls of legal jargon and emotional defenses. But this was different. This was her life, her story, her own heart that had been shattered into fragments. How could she face a reality that didn't make sense? How could she confront a truth that, even as it began to form, felt too painful to bear? The weight of the decision pressed down on her chest as she sat in the empty courtroom, the echoes of the trial still lingering in the air. It was late, past midnight, but Karen had asked for the room. She needed the solitude, the space to think. The polished wood of the bench, the cold, indifferent gavel, all seemed so distant now. Everything felt detached, as though she were watching her own life from a distance, as if it belonged to someone else. A soft knock broke her thoughts, and she looked up to see Emily standing in the doorway. The concern on her face was unmistakable, but there was something else there, an understanding, a quiet resolve. "I found something else," Emily said, walking in slowly. "Something that might help." Karen looked at her assistant, feeling the familiar stirrings of anxiety rise in her chest. "What is it now?" Emily placed a folder on the table in front of Karen. "I went back through some old case files. I don't know if it'll make sense, but I think it's something you need to see." Karen felt her stomach churn as she opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. It was a police report, old and yellowed with age, dated back to the time when she had first taken on her new identity, when everything had changed. "It's about your case," Emily said, her voice tight with emotion. "The one where your old identity disappeared." Karen's heart skipped a beat as she read through the report, her eyes widening in shock. The document was filled with details she had never seen before, details about a woman named Ruth Miller, and a child whose name had been redacted. The pieces began to fall into place, but the picture was one she wasn't sure she was ready to see. Ruth Miller was. Karen's voice broke as she read further, realizing what the report was hinting at. The child listed in the document, Daniel's name wasn't redacted after all. She stared at the name in disbelief. Daniel. That's him. Emily nodded gravely, her expression unwavering. Yes. And there's more. The report mentions that Ruth was found, dead. She died in a car accident shortly after the adoption. The child was placed in foster care, and everything after that is a blur. Karen felt a cold wave wash over her. But why didn't I remember any of this? Why didn't I know? Emily placed a hand on her arm, her voice soft but steady. Because they erased it. They erased you. Your past, your history, it was all wiped clean. They gave you a new name, a new life. Everything you thought was real, wasn't. It was all part of the cover-up. Karen closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. All the pieces of her life had been lies, carefully constructed, meticulously arranged, and then, with one swift stroke, erased. And now, she was standing in front of a past she didn't even recognize. The truth she had denied for so long was finally in her hands, and she couldn't escape it. "How do I face this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How do I confront everything I thought I knew about myself?" Emily didn't say anything at first, letting the silence settle between them. Then, she gently placed a hand on Karen's shoulder. "One step at a time. You don't have to have all the answers right now. But Daniel's waiting for you. He needs you to take the next step, just like you need him to help you understand what happened." Karen stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. She felt like she was walking through a fog made up of broken memories and forgotten identities. The woman she had been, the judge, the woman in control, felt like a distant shadow, someone she used to know. She wasn't sure who she was anymore, or what she was supposed to do with the pieces of her shattered identity. But there was one thing she knew for sure, she couldn't keep running. Not anymore. "I'll go," Karen said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll meet him." Emily gave her a small, encouraging smile. "You're stronger than you think." Karen walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the past heavy on her shoulders. She didn't know what she was walking into, but for the first time in days, she felt a sense of purpose. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't even know if she could ever piece together the broken fragments of her life. But she did know one thing: the truth was waiting for her. And for better or worse, she had to face it. The world outside the courtroom was quiet, unnervingly so. The hum of the city felt distant, almost muted, as if it, too, were holding its breath for what was to come. Karen's every step felt deliberate, as though the ground beneath her feet might crack and swallow her whole. Her mind raced with questions, yet no answers seemed to come. The road ahead, unclear and uncertain, felt like a dark, twisting tunnel she had to walk through alone. As she approached the small, nondescript building where Daniel was waiting for her, the weight of the moment grew heavier. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, as though it was echoing the uncertainty of her choices. What if I'm not ready? What if the truth is more than I can bear? But it was too late to turn back now. She had crossed the point of no return. The past, the life she had tried to outrun, had caught up to her. Daniel had reached out to her, and whether she was prepared or not, she had to face him. And, in turn, face herself. The door to the building was unlocked, and as she stepped inside, the dim lighting cast long shadows on the walls. She could hear soft voices, but it wasn't until she reached the back room that she saw him, Daniel. He was sitting by a window, staring out into the night with a look of quiet intensity on his face. He hadn't noticed her at first, and for a moment, Karen simply stood there, taking in the sight of him. There was something so familiar about him, something that felt like it belonged to her, something she couldn't yet understand. The sound of her footsteps on the floor broke the silence, and Daniel slowly turned toward her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that spoke volumes, something that made Karen's heart ache. "Karen," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "You came." Karen swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. "I came," she replied, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. She stepped forward, stopping a few feet from him. "Daniel. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, looking down at his hands for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "I know you've been through a lot. But I need you to understand something." Karen nodded, her breath catching in her throat. "I want to understand. But I don't know how. I don't know where to start." Daniel stood up and took a tentative step toward her, his gaze unwavering. "Start with me. Start with the truth." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Karen felt her chest tighten. The truth. It was a word that seemed so simple, so clear, yet in that moment, it felt like the most complicated thing in the world. She had spent her life avoiding it, burying it beneath layers of lies and half-truths. But now, with Daniel standing before her, the truth seemed impossible to ignore. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How did you know? How did you know who I am?" Daniel's face softened, and for the first time, Karen saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the same vulnerability she had long buried within herself. "I don't know how I knew. It was like a feeling, something deep inside me that told me you were my mom. I've been searching for you my whole life, Karen. I've never stopped looking." Karen felt her heart break as she took a step back. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of Daniel's words crashing down on her. His mom? The thought seemed impossible, surreal. How could it be true? She had never known him, never even known that he existed. But in his eyes, she saw a desperation, a longing for connection, for the truth. And deep down, something stirred within her, something that felt like recognition, like an undeniable bond that had been there all along. "Why didn't you tell me?" Karen's voice broke, her emotions spilling out of her like a dam finally giving way. "Why didn't you come to me sooner? Why didn't you?" "Because I didn't know if you'd believe me," Daniel interrupted softly, his eyes searching hers. "I didn't know if you'd want to hear it. I didn't know if you could accept it." Karen felt her knees weaken as she tried to process everything. She was his mother. It didn't seem possible. She had spent so many years building her life, her identity, and now it felt like everything was slipping through her fingers. "I don't remember you," Karen said quietly, her voice full of sorrow. "I don't remember anything about my past. I don't even remember you being born. I don't know how this could be real." Daniel took a step forward, his expression softening. "I don't expect you to remember. I don't expect you to know me. But I've always known you, Karen. I've always been looking for you." For a long moment, they just stood there in silence, the weight of their shared history pressing in on them. The years, the lost time, the pain, they all hung between them, thick and suffocating. But even through the confusion and uncertainty, Karen felt something stir within her. It wasn't just a recognition of the boy before her. It was a deeper feeling, a connection that had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. "I'm sorry," Karen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what to do. You don't have to fix anything, Daniel replied gently. You don't have to have all the answers. But I need you to understand, what matters now is us. What matters now is that we face the truth together. No more hiding. No more running. Tears welled up in Karen's eyes as she looked at the boy, her son, before her. The son she had never known, the son she had lost, and the son who had found her when she least expected it. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know how she would navigate this new reality, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. In that moment, as they stood facing each other, Karen realized something. The truth wasn't just about what had happened in the past. It was about who they were now. It was about moving forward, together, and finding a way to heal the wounds of the past. And so, as the truth unfolded before her, Karen made a vow: she would no longer hide from it. She would no longer run from her past. She would face it, no matter how painful, no matter how uncertain. She would fight for the future that awaited her, one that was finally grounded in the truth. The past had caught up with her, and the weight of it was heavy, but in that moment, Karen knew, the future, however uncertain, was hers to shape. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun.